Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy by Warren Mosler. Public Purpose. For me, all federal public policy begins and ends with public purpose. I begin with a brief list of the functions of government, all of which comprise what can be called public infrastructure, that in my estimation do serve public purpose and should be provisioned accordingly. The first is defense. It is my strong belief that without adequate military defenses, the world's democracies, a word I'll use for most forms of representative governments, are at risk of physical invasion and domination by nations with dictatorships and other related forms of totalitarianism. While democracies will move to defend themselves, in today's world, it is most often the dictatorships that move militarily to attack other nations without the provocation of a military threat. Examples include Pakistan threatening India, North Korea threatening not only South Korea but others in the region, Russia supporting military actions against most any Western democracy, Israel under constant threat of attack by all the region's dictatorships, and the Taliban attempting to take control of Afghanistan and disrupt any attempt at establishing representative government. It is evident to me that if the Western democracies decided to abandon all defense measures, they would immediately become subject to hostile invasion on multiple fronts. Therefore, there is a critical public purpose being served by allocating real resources to national defense. The next step is to set the objectives of our defense effort. At one time, this included the ability to fight a prolonged war on two fronts, much like the European and Pacific fronts of World War II. Other objectives have included the ability to strike mostly anywhere in the world within a certain number of hours with a force of a predetermined size, to maintain air superiority, and to be able to deliver nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union and other potentially hostile nations which can direct nuclear weapons at the U.S., and, more recently, to have the capability of using drones to assassinate hostile individuals remotely anywhere in the world. These are all military objectives. Some are general, some very specific. In the United States, they are ultimately political choices. For me, this means the President, as Commander-in-Chief, submitting these types of high-level military objectives to Congress for approval, and then working to achieve those objectives by proposing more specific military options to accomplish our national goals. The President proposes objectives and what is needed to accomplish those objectives, and the Congress reviews, debates, and modifies the objectives and proposals to meet those objectives and appropriates the resources it decides necessary to meet what it decides best serves the nation's military objectives. Most of the world's democracies, and particularly those with a U.S. military presence, have, however, come to rely on the assumption that the U.S. would ultimately defend them. Often, though not always, this is through formal alliances. This ultimate reliance on the U.S. military has resulted in these nations not allocating what would otherwise be substantial portions of their real wealth to their national defense. One option for addressing this issue would be to meet with the world's democracies and establish what a fair contribution to the U.S. defense effort would be for these nations, and then go so far as to publish a non-defense pledge for those who refuse to contribute their fair share of real goods and services to the common defense. The right-sized defense has everything to do with actual defense needs and nothing to do with the total expenditures of dollars necessary to meet the nation's defense needs. Nor need there any mention of how are we going to pay for it, as taxes function to regulate aggregate demand and not to raise revenue per se. The way we, the current generation, always pay for it is by the real resources, goods, and services that are allocated to the military that could have remained in the private sector for private consumption. The real cost includes all the people serving in the military who could have been working and producing goods and services in the private sector for private consumption. That includes everything from auto workers to tennis instructors, lawyers, doctors, and stockbrokers. The right size and right type of defense can change dramatically over relatively short periods of time. China's capability of shooting down satellites and Iranian medium-range nuclear missiles that could threaten our shipping are but two examples of how the advance of military technology can very quickly make prior technologies instantly obsolete. Both objectives and options must be under continuous review, and there can be no let-up in advancing new technologies to do all we can to stay on the leading edge of military effectiveness. About 10 years ago, I was discussing the military with a member of the Pentagon. He said that we needed to increase the size of the military. I said that if we wanted to do that, we should have done it 10 years ago, 1990, when we were in a recession with high unemployment and excess capacity in general. Back then, with all that excess capacity, a buildup of the military would not have been taking as many productive resources away from the private sector as it would have done during a period of full employment. He responded, "Yes, but back then we couldn't afford it. The nation was running a budget deficit, while today, with a budget surplus, we can afford it." This is completely backwards. The government never has nor doesn't have any dollars. The right amount of spending has nothing to do with whether the budget is in surplus or deficit. They use the monetary system, which provides no information, for all their information.